Welcome to Blender. So today we're going to be making the snowman. First, you can remove the cube with Object and Delete. Then you can do Add, Mesh, and UV Sphere. Right-clicking the sphere and clicking Shade Smooth will smooth out the sphere. Next, by clicking the arrows in the toolbar and clicking the blue arrow and dragging down, you can move the sphere down. Then, by hitting S and dragging away from the center of the sphere, you can enlarge the sphere. Next, you can right-click the sphere and hit Duplicate Objects. Afterwards, hitting Z while the object is attached to your mouse will lock it to the Z axis. Left-clicking where you want the object to be placed after dragging it. Left-clicking where you want the object to be placed, and then hitting S and dragging towards the center of the object will shrink it and place it. Next, we can hit Add, Mesh, and Cube. This will be for the stick arms. Then by using the movement tool on the toolbar and hitting the green arrow, we'll move it against the Y-axis to the left. Switching to the scale tool allows you to manipulate the object's dimensions. As you can see, I made it shorter and thinner, and I also extended it to make it a long stick shape. Switching to the rotate tool, I'll rotate it a little bit on the X-axis, and then I'll hit S and shrink the object by going towards its center. Now I'll right-click and duplicate the object. Then I'll switch to the movement tool and move it to the edge of the stick and give it fingers. Then I'll use the rotate tool to rotate it on the X-axis. Then moving it and shrinking it into the other stick. Right here, I'll right-click and hit Duplicate Object, and then I'll right-click again, moving the object back to its original duplicated location. Then, what I'll do is I'll just drag and select all three of these parts, and then use the Transform tool to move it to the right with the green arrow. And I'll right-click and hit Duplicate Object, and then I'll hit the Y key to lock it to the Y axis while it's grabbed to my mouse, and then I'll just slide it over to the other side, left clicking when I want to let go. Next, I'll use the rotate tool and the Z axis while holding Control to rotate in segments instead of rotating on a linear basis, so I can give it a perfect 180-degree rotation. Next, I'll add a cylinder and transform it to make a button. Next, I can use the scale tool and drag across the X-axis to make it look more button-shaped. Then I'll hit the S key, dragging towards the center of the object until it's a good size. Then I hit the X button on the right top in the 3D control, and that locks me to a 2D view of the X-axis, right-clicking the button and hitting Duplicate Object, and then hitting Z to drag up and down the chest. Then I turn my camera to the side to see how much they're poking out. As you can see, they're poking out quite a lot. Then I use the rotate tool and the Y-axis to rotate the buttons so they match the chest of the snowman, using the movement tool to drag it into the chest. Next, I'll hit Add, Mesh, and I'll add a cone. This cone is covered by the inside of the snowman, so I'll just drag it to the side to be able to see it. Then I'll rotate it with the rotation tool. Using the scale tool, I can elongate the cone in order to give it a more carrot-like shape. Then I right-click it and hit Shade Smooth. There are Shade Auto Smooth and Shade Smooth. You don't have to worry about Shade Auto Smooth. It may not be available to you. Then I use the axes to align it with the face of the snowman, And then using the S key and dragging towards the center of the cone, I can make it smaller to fit inside the head. Then I'll add another UV sphere as an eye for the snowman. Moving it up and using the scale tool to squish it down. Then I do the same thing I did with the buttons, holding S and shrinking the object down, and then manipulating it to match the curvature of the face. I recommend getting as tight an angle as you can to make sure that it's not popping out or floating in the distance. Then here, I right click and hit X Global. Now, what X Global does is it mirrors the object on the X axis. First, make sure to duplicate your object to mirror it to the other side. So duplicate objects, and then you can use the, I think, Y axis, and then drag it to the right. Click down, and then right click, mirror X Global. Now I'm going to add another UV sphere and use that as the mouth for the snowman. Using the scale tool to squish it down again. Once again, I use my perspective to see what angle the object is against the sphere. I duplicate the mouthpiece over and over and use my perspective to angle it correctly each time I duplicate it. After placing all the face pieces, I click the X button in the 3D controller, and that locks me to a 2D view of the X-axis, allowing me to make sure my objects are even and symmetrical. Now I'll add a cylinder for the top hat. The cylinder I'll drag up to the top to be able to see it, and then I'll right click and shade it smooth. I'll use S once again to manipulate the size. Then I'll duplicate the object, and then I'll hit Z to lock it to the Z axis, just to make sure it's centered in the entire top hat. Then I'll use the scale tool to shrink this piece of the top hat. Then I'll use the S key to make it a little bigger. And then I'll flatten it one more time. Then I'll drag this piece down to the bottom part of the top hat. You can see me right clicking and hitting Shade Auto Smooth. If you have this feature, then you can use it. If you don't, it doesn't really matter, as the texture is going to hide all the mess ups with Shade Smooth anyway. Now I drag and select both objects, and then I drag it down to the top of the snowman, perfectly on top. Now that I've finished with all the modeling, now I'm going to start texturing. First, let's texture the top hat. Click on the little sphere second to last on the right menu and click New. You're creating a new texture. Naming it is not necessary, but it just keeps track and organizing. Then under base color, you'll see I change it to black, but it doesn't change to black in the scene. First, we have to click that little circle in the right top that changes it to material preview mode. You can also see me manipulate specular and roughness. Roughness just shows the roughness of the texture, and specular is the shininess. To add the texture to the bottom part of the top hat, you're going to click that drop down menu and click the texture you just made. Now I'll make the snow texture, making a new texture, and then I'll name it, and then I'll change the base color to the color I want for the snow, and I'll manipulate the specular and roughness a little bit. A very important thing to note is when you select an object and you're adding a texture, make sure the selected object is in primary selection mode, which means it has an orange outline instead of a red outline. Only one object can be in primary selection mode at a time, meaning when I select these two branches, both of them are in secondary selection mode, and nothing is in primary selection mode. So I deselect and select again to get one of the branches into primary selection mode. Then I individually select each branch and click and add the branch texture. Here I forgot to shade smooth these buttons, so I'll just smooth them. Then I'll also make a texture for the buttons. After texturing the objects, now we're going to set up our camera for the final render. So to see what the default camera sees, you can click on the camera button on the right side of the screen. Inside this box is what the render will be. That doesn't look very appealing. So what we're going to do is we're going to move it backwards. Clicking on the camera with the movement tool shows you that blue is the z-axis, green is the y-axis, and red is the x-axis. Now, at the top of our screen, you'll see global. If we change that to local, it means instead of following the global perspective of movement, it'll follow the local object's perspective of movement. So now, when I use the z-axis, it actually goes back and forth for the camera. Then I use the y-axis to get the top hat a little bit more in view. Then I move it along the z-axis a little bit more to zoom it out a bit. Now I have the object perfectly in view. Next is to look at the lighting in our scene. Click the circle next to the material preview to see the final render preview. As you can see, the lighting by default already looks pretty good, but I'm just going to increase the intensity of it. After you're satisfied with the lighting, the snowman, the angle of the camera, then you can finally go to the left top, click render, and click render image. Then clicking image in the render screen and hitting save as will allow you to save it to anywhere on your computer. The file it saves is an image file and not the .blend file.